And let's start the meeting, and I wish everybody a very good morning in other parts of the world, especially in USA and Canada, and a very good evening to the friends here in India, and a good day to all others who are joining us from different parts of the world, other parts of the world. So this is a very important topic that we have arranged today through our forum. This is a very important book. When I saw the book, I was very interested in getting both Charles and Anver to speak to us, and when I contacted them, they were absolutely thrilled to even discuss with us, and they were very quick in accepting my invitation and my request. So I must thank them first. And as you know, both of them are distinguished scholars, and they have contributed immensely to the subject of their respective fields and the subject of their studies. For instance, Charles Vella, I'm reading out from his a brief bio that I have with me. He's a senior fellow at Al-Farabi Kazakh National University, and an associate professor of history at the Washington State Universities. Among the works in English and Kazakh, Weller most recently edited 21st century narratives of the world history, global and multidisciplinary perspectives, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2017. And right now he's working on a very interesting book on which very little or absolutely no research has been done. In fact, it's about the mosaic and Sharia law in American national history and identity. It's going to be published by Brill, which is a very, very distinguished and a very top-class publication, and not easy to publish there. So this book is going to be very important. It compares the what do you call mosaic and Sharia law in American national history, and how that shaped American history and even law, perhaps. That's going to be an interesting book to look forward to. And after that, and he has also written, I think, on pre-Islamic survivals in Tsarist and Soviet ethnography of the Kazakh and Central Asian peoples. I don't know if this is a forthcoming book or if it's going to be, it's already been published, but then it's another important work. And Professor Anver Emon is a distinguished professor of law and history at Canada Research Chair in Canada. He's part of the Canada Research Chair in Islamic and Legal History, Director, Institute of Islamic Studies, University of Toronto. Emon has published widely in Islamic legal history, including authoring Islamic natural law theories in the Oxford University, published by the Oxford University Press. He specializes in Islamic natural law. That's what he's going to speak about, and that's what his contribution is also, insofar as this particular book which we are discussing today is concerned. And in fact, I have read another book of Anwar a long time back. It was on Zimmis, it's called Religious Pluralism in Islamic Law, Zimmis and Others in Empire of Law. That again was published by the Oxford University Press in 2002. So I'm sure this is going to be a very interesting conversation that you're going to have with both Professors Charles and Professor Anver. And as I just told you, the format is going to be Charles will speak first for about 20 minutes on the book, and which will be followed by Anver, and then Anver, I, and Charles will have a small brief conversation on the book, and then we open it up for questions for about 50 to 60 minutes. So once again, I welcome the speakers and the participants. Thank you so much, friends, and over to you, Charles.
Thank you very much, Fazur, and assalamu alaikum, everybody. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. It's really a great privilege. Just a couple words about myself. I've lived 14 years of my life in two different Asian countries. I lived 6 years in Japan. I lived for 8 years in Kazakhstan. I did my PhD in Kazakhstan at Al-Farabi Kazakh National University, working in the Kazakh language. I wrote and defended in the Kazakh language. That was a decision I made because I wanted to show respect for their knowledge, for their educational system. I wasn't just a visiting, scholar. I did my PhD entirely in their system, in their language, under their direction. Again, because for me, it's been very important. So I speak Japanese and Kazakh, fairly fluently, certainly as a foreigner, but enough to get by. And it's been life-changing for me. It's been world-changing, right? And the people of India, you speak various languages already growing up. You probably know the joke about being trilingual or bilingual, and those that speak one language are American. But it's been very, perspective changing for me, and I value it greatly. And so I value this kind of time that we have to interact together in this world for world peace. Ultimately is where I come from, hopefully. All of us know and realize the tragic state of our world, at least from my own perspective. My own country has contributed to that significantly, and I can't really express to you the grief that is in my heart over that kind of a thing. I can't even begin to express it. There's really a great deal of tragedy and sorrow in these kinds of things, and it's, for me, what makes these kinds of topics so very important, and this kind of dialogue. I'm a believer in dialogue. There are many complications in dialogue. I understand those, the political, the cultural, the religious, etc. And I understand them more and more as I continue to engage and see all of the landmines that we have to try to navigate through our scholarship and through our discussions. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity, and I'm grateful for everybody else participating as well. Our volume, Reason, Revelation, and Law in Islamic Western Theory and History. I'm going to move through this fairly quickly, but just to give you a couple of the endorsements that came from Ziba Mir Hosseini at SOAS in London, says this volume sheds light on how the debates about these topics have left their mark on the histories and identities of various Muslim and Western cultures, and how they have shaped the course of their past and present encounters with one another, an important and challenging contribution to overcoming current othering and to developing the possibilities of mutual respect and coexistence and difference. I'm thrilled to see that others see that in the volume. Certainly that's something we hope to lift out. An important contribution to ongoing efforts to understand the profound intellectual and spiritual connections that long made relations between Islam and the West seem more like a family quarrel than a clash of civilizations. The well-documented, vividly argued essays should be of considerable interest to lawyers, diplomats, and conflict resolution specialists, as well as to sociologists and historians of religion. By demonstrating how great Muslim and Christian scholars jointly discovered and developed essential concepts like natural law, this book revives one's faith in the possibility of future cooperative relations. That's Richard E. Rubenstein, University professor at George Mason. And he's also written a book called Aristotle's Children, how Muslims, Jews, and Christians all drew from the Aristotelian heritage there. So anyway, we're grateful for those affirmations. Just briefly here, the table of contents so that you can see the different contributions there. My own chapter on the historical relation of Islamic and Western law. Ulrika Martinson through the lens of the Quranic covenant, theories of natural law and social contract, and Al-Tabari's exegesis in history, Edward Moad, Al-Ghazali's ethics and natural law theory, Karen Taliaferro, elitist democracy and epistemic equality, Aristotle and Ibn Rushd on the role of common beliefs, and then Ainur Kurman Aliyeva, a comparative study of reason and revelation in relation to natural and divine law, and Al-Farabi and Ibn Rushd, and of course, Anver, Emon, and critical reflections in retrospect and prospect to finish out the volume. My own chapter I summarize in this way: within a larger world historical context of cross-cultural contact and exchange, various forms of Western and Islamic law have reciprocally influenced one another throughout their long centuries of interaction, from the rise of Islam in the early 7th century to the 15th century CE and beyond. Thus, various forms of Western law and culture, of course, more broadly, already contain within them varying degrees of influence from diverse forms of Islamic law and culture. Notice here my emphasis upon diversity within the Islamic world. I'm not positing some monolithic Islamic world or some monolithic Western civilization. There are, diverse forms of quote unquote Western civilization and Islamic civilization, however we choose to define those constructs, which we also deal with in the beginning of the volume. But there's various forms of each and the other, and the large amount of shared heritage and reciprocal exchange across 14 centuries results in inclusive as opposed to exclusive understandings of each society. Various Western societies are in varying measure partly Islamic already, and various Islamic societies are partly Western through 1400 years of this exchange going on. Now, this is in accordance with a topic that I continuously teach on to my students in my writings, etc., and will continue to develop, and that is Islamic contributions to Western civilization. I trust that I don't need to expound to any of you about all of the various cultural, philosophical, medical, literary, and political and legal, as well as many other forms of influence that have come from various societies of the Islamic world into various societies of the Western world across the centuries. There are continuing debates about those, but also some indisputable facts. This also is in accordance with the book, many books, but one by Nayef Arif al-Radhan, The Role of the Arab Islamic World in the Rise of the West, Implications for Contemporary Transcultural Relations. In fact, this builds off, and this is what I end my own specific chapter on about this exchange across the centuries between Islamic and Western forms of law and the mutual borrowing and negotiated settlements that have occurred between them throughout those long centuries, is that UNESCO founded. I understand there are many problems with the founding of UNESCO in relation to Western imperialism and colonialism, etc. But UNESCO established a Global History of Humanity project there, and they've tried to move away from the Western imperial parts of that, but it was to recognize and incorporate the contributions of all the world's various peoples and cultures to one another, a mutual interdependence, as it were. And I find this extremely important. I like to frame things in terms of at least three major options. That's conflict, conversion, or coexistence. It's not just an either or. It's not just a clash of civilizations or the other. It's really about the conflict from smallest scale to largest scale, or conversion. And when I talk about conversion, I do not just mean religious conversion. I mean cultural conversion. I mean political conversion to political systems and ideologies, to economic systems and ideologies in various nations, states, societies, trying to influence, whether it be through salesmanship or coercion, military might, threat, or downright, imperial conquest, whatever the case, but trying to convert the other to their ways of thinking and doing things. And then the question of coexistence, and what does that mean? Are we talking about assimilation models of coexistence? That goes back to conversion, essentially. If we're talking about genuine coexistence with one another, being able to accept one another for who we each are without having to enter into conflict and without having to try to convert the other, respecting each other and being able to negotiate a peaceful coexistence together, well, that is to me a different model, and it's a challenging model. Raises all kinds of questions. Maybe we'll come back to them later. But I do want to talk about at least two major trends in post-World War II historiography, and that is one of them, the politics of post-colonialist versus post-Nazi anti-racist historiographies. And this really has to do with history's presentations of cultural relations between people which posit them, which portray them as being isolated, independent developments, which are not dependent upon one another, and or cross-cultural contact and exchange. I put this into a chart in this way because it involves questions of credit versus blame. If somebody has influenced another in a positive way, well, that's to their credit, right? If it's imperialist, well, then there's blame involved in that, right? We forced the culture or the politics or the religion or whatever it is upon the other. And so again, and then that comes to beneficial or harmful, and the arguments between, you know, whether the British Empire was beneficial to India or harmful to what degree, right? And you guys know all about that. And then forced, willing, intentional rejection, etc. But on the left side here, you see that I'm talking about historical cause-effect approaches. And now this is to framing the histories and the relations of the different societies and cultures and peoples within that history. How do we frame it and frame those relations together? Do we frame it in terms of this historical cause-effect interaction relationship? And if we do so, do we do that in a monodirectional cultural diffusion that one society, this is the standard Western narrative, right? That everything starts in the West, and the West even claims the Middle East, Near East, and Mesopotamia in the ancient period, and then it moves into the Greek and Roman periods, and then goes into Europe, and all of that is interpreted as Western history, and then that history becomes the starting point of all human history, and it becomes the well springs, right? The source of all history that influences all of the rest in a positive way. And anything that deviates from that is a negative, right? Deviation away from the positive trajectory. That's the Western kind of model and a simplistic approach. Or are we talking about mutual, multi-directional, reflexive influence between the societies and cultures, which is more realistic in my opinion? That whenever 2, 3, 4, 5 different societies interact with one another, they are influencing each other in various ways to varying degrees. All right, so a couple models of historical cause-effect in relationship between societies. Then you have anthropological, psychological, and other theories which are non-cause-effect approaches. They're independent, isolated developments. You've seen the changes, if you've watched, in the post-World War II period in particular, in reactions against colonialism and against colonial imperial narratives of history, which portray this monodirectional diffusion of Western culture to all of the rest of the world, or whether it's China or India or anybody else that's supposed to be the originator and bequeather of their great heritage to others. But then you get this isolated, no, we developed that ourselves, that's ours, and it's like yours, it comparably is similar to yours, but we developed it ourselves independently of you. And these are all landmines in the construction of history, how we do it. But along those lines, we also have a model of divine revelation now that I want to talk about, because divine revelation models also are this kind of exclusionary, they can be. They not always are, but this is where we get into definitions, right, about how we understand divine revelation in relationship to the natural world and natural processes. And that is that divine revelational models in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, some of them, not all, but some of them can be isolated, independent. They want to set up this separating out of that tradition as though it were untouched by any other traditions of the world, any other human forces, etc. It all came directly down from God, directly to the prophet or prophets, whatever the case may be. And that communication line was, I like to liken it to analogy to a secure SSL internet connection that nobody can, penetrate, right? As this is the way they conceive it, is that God communicated directly to these prophets. There was no tainting of any human influence, etc., that was a part of that. It was all from God. It was purely divine, and God gave it all to that person, and then that becomes pure, and therefore it's pure, true, correct, accurate, 100%. And I consider this kind of a model a special pleading model because it isolates and separates off that particular tradition from the rest of humanity in a way, and it then isolates it from any kind of penetration from the rest of humanity, at least in terms of what that divine revelation is specifically. And I consider this a case of special pleading. But we see this in the Jewish and Christian tradition, or the Christian in particular. And we have all of these non-Christian sources that scholars propose as having influenced Christianity, whereas these purists in the divine revelational sense, again, I have different models of divine revelation, but in this purist, exclusionary, isolated model, they don't want to acknowledge any of those other influences on the divine revelation itself, because of course that taints it, that makes it impure, that raises all kinds of problems. You have a similar thing within the Islamic tradition, right? The Western scholars tend to emphasize these influences from other cultural, historical, societal empires and things surrounding Arabia and the Arabs, etc. And you get this response that denies all of that and affirms strictly this pure revelation from God to Muhammad in the Quran. In my chapter note, well, I'm going to skip because of time, but I talk about, and many scholars have talked about, the jizya, for instance, that's mentioned in the Quran, and that this existed in various very similar forms amongst the Greek Byzantines, the Persians, and pre-Islamic Arabian laws and customs. It was spread all around that society and culture, and when it gets mentioned in the Quran, it's not really expounded upon, and therefore it's very difficult to deny, in my opinion, that reference by Muhammad is interconnected with and influenced by and even dependent upon this broader context, historical context that he's a part of. But that raises questions about how is it then purely, strictly the revelation of the angel Gabriel to Muhammad in that sense. I also talk, and Anver can maybe address this later at some point, but the Covenant of Umar, it reveals many characteristics in common with the Sasanian Persian regulations for religious minorities in particular, and then has others as well that it adopts from along the way. And I'm not going to go too far into that, but I've got about 1 minute left here. So all of that is about historical influence, and let me try to sum it up in this way. As a human community, as a global human community of various cultures, states, societies, etc., religions, how we relate together, how we have to interact. We can't live in isolated bubbles. It's impossible, or maybe we could, but it doesn't seem possible. We have to interact with each other. And as we interact with each other, it seems we need humility and openness and a willingness to learn from each other and to receive from each other and to contribute to each other and try to work together as a human community for the best benefit of humanity that we can. And that involves a recognition of those processes within history. And to deny that is to deny our human connections and mutual influence, etc., along the way, and to project that back into interpretations of history as well. My last thing I'll end is my 1 second finishes on my timer is...
Charles, John, you can take a little more time.
Well, I'll make it short, but you know, the whole idea of now I switch from divine revelational models and issues. So divine revelation can, in fact, be conceived as including historical cross-cultural influence. You can have a model of divine revelation that is inclusive of historical, cultural influence, as well as that has a place for human reason within it along the way. And this meeting between the divine world and the human world of divine revelation and human reason, as it were, and all of the chapters in our volume address that tension and how that tension gets, attempted to be resolved and handled in the various figures that they treat, altar body, etc. On the flip side, I just want to say that the dangers at the far extreme of a completely naturalistic version of revelation that we then attribute to God. If we conceive of revelation as only coming through natural means, and then we divinize that, we attribute divine sacred quality to that natural revelation, we can run into major problems of equating acts of nature with acts of God, or acts of humans with acts of God, or thoughts of humans with thoughts of God. And it becomes very complex. I trust all of you are well aware of those kinds of things, but I end my presentation with all of that as food for thought. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Charles. In fact, I thought if you wanted to some more time, you could have taken it. You know, I mean, we're not very strict about.
Well, later on, thank you, Faisal. Later we can talk more together. It's no problem.
Sure, sure. I think then perhaps I would now request Anver to present his, do his presentation and maybe enlighten us about his contribution to the book. Over to you, Anver. Thank you.
We can't hear you.
I think perhaps his mic is muted. Oh. Anver, can you hear me? You'll have to unmute your mic, Anver. Yes, I think you are muted now.
No, we still can't hear. I think there is some problem with the audio.
Oh, we can't hear. Or maybe his connection has, because we were able to hear him some time back.
Yes, he's joining back, I think.
Okay, I think he is logged out and joining back. See, sometimes Zoom can be complicated. I think that was very interesting, Charles. You know, you spoke about the last part of your talk on reason and revelation, you know, the divine revelation. There has always been a tug of war on that, right? People, the legal positivists in Islam, they say that it's only divine law that is the real law. Humans just can't have that law at all. There's no such thing as natural law. I'm sure Anver will talk about it more, but perhaps we can discuss it a little later on how do we reconcile this. I think Anver is trying.
Until Anver connects there.
Yeah, maybe you can go ahead, Charles. Till he comes back.
I'll just say in response that one of the essential starting points for me is my existence, and my existence, our existence is the essential starting point. And number two, our finitude, our limited nature as human beings that we have to acknowledge. And that from that starting point, it's a starting point of humility and dialogue, of learning from one another and talking to understand each other.
True. Yes, that is most important. The dialogue, you know, we try to build bridges, not burn them. That's what most of us do these days. In fact, I was talking about it in our forum today, about why we should build bridges between communities, religious or cultural or whatever, not burn them. I think I can see Anver. He's back.
Yes,
Anver,
can you hear me now?
Yes, we can see and hear you. Great. Thanks a lot, Anver. Please go ahead.
My apologies for that. That tech was on my end. It was my issues there, so I apologize for the delay.
Oh, there's no need.
Let me just, what I wanted to do was speak about, one about the broad contours of the book, to which, you know, first I want to acknowledge the leadership that Charles brought to the book. I came into the project somewhat late after an email exchange that had been going on one of the various academic listservs. Charles was very much involved in it. It was it was a fascinating way to see how an online conversation in real time took shape in the form of this book that now captures multiple positions on issues around reason, revelation, and so on. And so it was Charles who led the endeavor, Charles who pushed forward this endeavor, and I'm grateful to have been brought along for the ride. But I want to acknowledge his leadership throughout this process, and to thank him for including me as part of the project. There's two things I think are worth discussing here. One is at least one way to think about reason and revelation. And through my own work of natural law theories, that's one way. We could talk philosophy, we could talk theology or kalam in the Islamic tradition. I am a lawyer by training, I'm a historian by training, and so I come to that disciplinarily. I came to the topic as a discipline through legal history. And so mine is specifically to that. What's interesting about Islamic law, however, is that it's not just doctrine, right? There's theological presumptions that we make about God and God in the world that affect what we can and can't say legally, what takes shape legally. And I think it's important to recognize that whereas in most secular presumptions of law, theology is out of the picture, but in Islamic law, theology becomes a very significant feature of our conversation, even if it's not at the forefront. Oftentimes it's in the backdrop. And so what my remarks will to illustrate how, in thinking through a very specific idea of revelation, or reason in revelation in Islamic law, we will be moving between theology and law. And if there's time, I'd like to then think about it in the applied context of the dhimmi, who I think offers a case that's been brought up a couple times so far today, and I thought might be useful given the context that we're in. So my own work in this area took shape in a book I published in 2010 called Islamic Natural Law Theories, and thereafter worked with a rabbi and a Catholic theologian to think as a trialogue between how do our three traditions approach this idea. And then now in the volume that Charles has led, this is the third vehicle that I've been able to engage this particular topic. And what's been fascinating is not just the idea of engaging the Islamic tradition, but also the reaction to the topic from both the academy, but also from well, to be honest, well-meaning Sunnis. And it's been interesting navigating the intellectual minefields there. So let me just tell you a little bit about what I've argued, where I think the conversation is right now, where I think we can go. What I really argued is if you look at theological debates in the medieval period about God's justice, the Adl Allah, there were two main camps, your Mu'tazila and your Ash'ari from in early centuries of Islam. Of course, there's been a different sort of theological history that we can write since then, but I take these two as focal points. And your Mu'tazila, as I'm sure most in this room know, were deemed your rationalists of Islam. For a while, they were deemed the orthodoxy under Caliph al-Ma'mun, but after his demise and the Mihna of the 9th century, ultimately the orthodox table reversed and Ash'ari dominance prevailed, which has since morphed into a whole bunch of other things. What's interesting about the Ash'aris and the Mu'tazilis, however, is they fundamentally debated about God's justice. Really, one way to say it is, is on the one hand, if God wills something, is that therefore just? And for the Ash'aris, who are voluntarists, they say, look, it's all about God's will. If God says it's so, it's so. If God says lying is good, then it's good. It's all about deferring to God's will. And the Mu'tazilis were a little bit different. They said, well, maybe actually we're able to reason to notions of good on the assumption that God would do that as well. In a sense, it's a counterfactual. They're arguing, had God made this clear, he would have decided the goodness or the badness of X. You can make X anything you want. He would have decided the goodness or badness of X in this way. And of course, there was an argument. Well, can you rationally hold God to these kinds of moral precepts? So it really was, is goodness, is badness rationally determinable? And therefore, can it be the basis on which to make obligations of law, of Sharia? And to the extent that we say Sharia is God's law, God's will, then of course you can see immediately the theological implications. How does human rationality translate into the will of God? That's a problem. Now, what's fascinating is if you look into the debates, and I looked into a very specific genre in our historical literature called usul al-fiqh, and I focused on Sunni usul al-fiqh just because I am not competent in the Shia tradition. It's not an area that I've studied. But I looked at the Sunni traditions, and I looked at, for instance, Al-Jassas, who was Hanafi, though it wasn't clear whether he was Mu'tazili or not. He might have been an early form of Maturidi theologian. And looking at him, looking at Al-Hasan al-Basri, looking at Qadi Abdul Jabbar, what we find in the Mu'tazili argument is that, yes, we can make rational arguments in the absence of scripture. So remember, it's about the absence of scripture. It's not in contrast to scripture. And so what they would argue in these works of usul al-fiqh is it's usually in these sections of usul al-fiqh of before there was revelation. Min qablu wurud al-shara is what they would say. Before revelation. Kevin Reinhardt has argued that this is a complex, the before revelation complex, and he makes a very strong theology argument around what this means. What I actually suggest instead is simply a counterfactual. Lawyers are great at hypotheticals. We come up with the craziest hypotheticals for our students on examinations, and those hypotheticals are designed to tease out core legal principles. So min qabla wudur ash-shad, before revelation, is a counterfactual. It's a hypothetical. What if there's no revelation on a matter? Now we could say before there was the existence of shad historically as a historical matter, i.e. before prophecy in the 7th century. That's one way of looking at it. But I look at it as an ongoing present conversation on issues come up and what if there's no revelation? And it's in that context that we see the Mu'tazilis and their adherents develop this jurisprudence out of their rational theology. One is, how do we argue from what is to what ought to be? And so the idea of arguing for natural law, in my context, is simply of saying, well, we have as post-enlightenment beings, we have this naturalistic fallacy that we cannot reason from an is to an ought. But if you move historically backward, you realize that if we endow the natural world with a kind of ontological authority, as a kind of text from God as well, if the world, the environment is God's text to us, it's simply a different way of reading. It's not scripture, so it's not revelation, but it's not that it is divorced somehow from God. So as we look at the empirical world and we make rational determinations, we make assessments of values here, there, and everywhere. And that's effectively one way of extending the Mu'tazili view. I call them the hard natural law theorists because they're hard and fast committed to the commitment that there is the possibility of reasoning from the natural order. The Asharis, however, who then became, your various Sunni madhabs, Shafi'i and others, argued quite differently, still convinced that you cannot impute to God a will that he hasn't articulated. They would say, no, you can't do that. Rather, we must abide by scripture. But when you start looking at their usul al-fiqh, they make a little tricky move. And this is where you catch them, right? Is that, when they start in their usul al-fiqh arguing against the Mu'tazili notion of justice, they say, well, okay, look, we can't say what the Mu'tazili say. We can't subject God to rationality, but does that mean we can't reason to the good or the bad, the husn or the qubh, as they would say? Well, we sort of can, and it was a bit of a trick. What they say is, it is not that we reason to the good and bad and come up with laws thereafter. because we can reason to God's will. Rather, we would argue that where God is silent on a matter in revelation, and we come up with a rational analysis of the good and bad, we say that, well, God is also, in addition to being just, God is very merciful, generous, and gracious. So on a different theological line, they simply say, we can reason to the good, because that is what God would have wanted for us, because not because he's just, but because he's gracious, merciful, and generous, which of course means that he could change his mind. But we have no evidence that he's changed his mind, so we go with this rational analysis. So they argue from nature, but they have a little catch clause or a contingency clause. So I call them soft natural law theorists, simply because they still argue from nature, but allow for the possibility of change in deference to God's presumable statement of will at some point that we might find out. So all of this is simply to say there is this embedded notion of rationality within our Islamic tradition. I'm just checking my time here.
No, you can take your time.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just take about a few more minutes. So that's the basic argument. Now, what we need to contend with are two really distinct issues. One is the study of Islam in the Western university is very much informed by the German university tradition. And the German university tradition locates the study of Islam in the faculties of theology. Since the 19th and early 20th century, those faculties of theology have studied Islam in the service of biblical historicism. And so to one extent, we need to recognize that to the extent Christian history is studied theologically, in theological terms, thanks to the Galatian doctrine of there's Christ's sovereignty and then there's the prince's sovereignty, then for the study of Christianity, theology becomes the central place of activity intellectually, at least a central activity. Law is, on the Protestant reading, somewhat peripheral. The Catholic reading is much more interesting because of the canonical law tradition. All of which is to say, we need to recognize that in the Western Academy, when Islam is construed in theological terms, my move to the law is economically problematic for those who want a job from that perspective, right? And there's a sociology of knowledge problem that we have to contend with. But then, so I do get criticisms from that line of argument that wants to preserve the primacy of theology, kalam, as the significant arbiter of what is and isn't Islamic. And there's important reasons to still respect that line. It's just a question we have to ask. Do we locate reason theologically? Do we locate it philosophically? Do we locate it legally? These are just different disciplines, and sometimes we have to pick. The second line of argument is from Sunnis. I get a lot of pushback from Sunnis, and good Sunni Asharis, who are concerned about the expansiveness of Mu'tazili rationality, but also the fact that I read Ash'ari theologians as simply engaging in the same kind of logic. Ultimately, my argument collapses Ash'ari and Mu'tazili arguments of theology, two lines of argument that ultimately define orthodoxy and heterodoxy, and I collapse them in law. And if you're a good Sunni, you're not going to like that either. And so what's interesting is the pushback I get on those two grounds. Maybe one way forward is to think beyond the Sunni-Ash'ari divide, and to think about theology as enabling, not disabling. So how do we anticipate a future form of theology that embraces rationality, that respects the divine will, and respects revelation in its various ways? It might be to expand the idea of revelation itself into God's creation, which would be consistent with a number of things around, say, animal rights, environmentalism, and so on. If we were to infuse environmental justice as a form of God's justice, we might see in nature a different kind of text or textuality. So those are the main ideas. The problem that I have with natural law is it's a bit idealistic. I mean, in many ways, natural law comes in as a critic of the state. Natural law comes in as an idealistic statement of what God's justice is. But when you really begin looking hard at the doctrine of Islamic law, let's say in the area of fiqh, we too often forget that medieval Muslim jurists, as well as contemporary ones, are embedded in structures of power. We might call it the state, they might have called it the empire, the Dar al-Islam versus the Dar al-Harb, but these institutional formations of power require regulation. And so when you look at something like, for instance, the dhimmi in Islamic law, we might say today that everyone is deserving of universal human rights. And those human rights are a product of our reason that apply to all of us by virtue of us being human. In which case, then, we confront, as Muslims and as adherents to this faith tradition, the argument that Islam is not tolerant. Why? Because they regulate the dhimmis. And you see a whole line of argument around dhimmitude or Muslim oppression of religious minorities, and so on and so forth. And everyone looks to chapter 9 of the Quran for the jizya verse, which talks about, fight them wherever you find them unless they pay you the jizya with their hands subdued or in a state of submission. Well, that sounds like a two-tiered hierarchy of citizenship. That doesn't sound very tolerant. And so one of the things we need to recognize is that there is this large doctrinal tradition around dhimmis that poses a problem for this argument about a kind of universal human rights in Islamic law. My concern with the tolerance framework is that it flattens what is already an incredibly political terrain. And so if you look around the world today, you'll see a number of states that we might call liberal, but engaging in a lot of illiberal activity. And they've done so for a long time. You look at the US Constitution, it had the 3/5 compromise around slavery. Why? To ensure Southern plantation voting in Congress, representation through that process. By giving a portion of humanity, but not full humanity, to slaves, you increase the demographics in the South, therefore affecting representation in the various legislative assemblies. If you look at Europe right now, you can see in France, for instance, the idea of French is also a very exclusionary idea. India, of course, has its own politics. Canada has its multiculturalism, which seems to exclude its indigenous populations. The fact is, in the name of natural law, we persecute people, we erase people from existence as if they're not there. The very idea, for instance, the Latin term terra nullius, which identified the New World as uninhabited, wasn't really saying there was no people there. It's just that it was terra nullius in the sense that there were no competing European interests over the land. It didn't matter that there were indigenous people already here. They didn't really matter in the factoring of the analysis. So when we look at the language of tolerance, I tend to look to Wendy Brown's regulating aversion and say, actually, are we really arguing for this tolerance-intolerance zero-sum game? Or are we simply saying that when it comes to minorities, every society has regulated them? Minorities get regulated into a state or a civil system. The dhimmis are no different than any other minority in any other system, liberal or otherwise. And so the argument there is simply to say, maybe with the dhimmis, we need to think more about the status of minorities in our world today, reshift the language around dhimmis from tolerance to minority rights, to minority regulation, and recognize that Islamic law is not all that different from what we've been seeing in the world today already when it comes to Blacks in the United States, when it comes to Muslims in India, Hindus and Christians in Pakistan, the Shia, the Hazara Shia in Afghanistan with respect to the Taliban, the Uyghurs in China. These are all different instantiations of the same problem. And so rather than saying that Islam has the ability to extend universal rationality that includes the humanity of everyone, maybe we simply say the Islamic legal tradition institutionalized within a context by jurists historically located is no different in its ugliness than any other legal system having to contend with difference. And it's in thinking about difference and its management that we need to perhaps relocate the conversation around minorities and therefore reason as well. Those are my remarks that I'd like to share with you today. Just I want to thank you all for listening. I know that it's later in the day in India, and I hope I'm not intruding into people's dinner or whatnot or family time.
No, not at all.
Thank you very much.